everyone. I am Sophie Kavulakos, Assistant Curator in the Department of Film here at MoMA and the organizer of this year's Doc Fortnight. We are so delighted to be presenting this New York premiere of Anthony Benoit Simon's Cane Fire. And I'm especially thrilled that with the national reach of MoMA's virtual cinema, that we can connect with viewers, communities, and conversations centered in the Hawaiian island of Kauai, the subject of Anthony's film. We can do that in a way we never could in our brick and mortar theaters. So welcome from wherever you are tuning in. Cane Fire presents a critical reading of Hawaii's depiction in Hollywood cinema and recuperates those narratives that have been left out. At the same time, it's also a really personal film exploring the filmmaker's family across generations. And to engage the film under all its angles, we have assembled this really terrific panel to take us through a discussion with the filmmaker. I'd like to thank them all for being here. I will briefly introduce our panelists. Our speakers, or panelists feels a little bit too formal. So you are our speakers today. Anthony Benoit Simon is a New York documentary filmmaker who works professionally as a freelance video editor, and Cane Fire is his first feature film. Kara Lacey is a native Hawaiian filmmaker whose focus is on telling stories that challenge the political and creative status quo. Jeff Chang is a writer, cultural organizer, and strategist. His last book and video series for Independent Lens was called We Gon' Be All Right, Notes on Race and Resegregation. Mike Vaz is a filmmaker based in Montreal and a co-writer and co-producer of Cane Fire. And the conversation will be moderated by Taylor Chang, curator of film and performance at Honolulu Museum of Art and the Doris Duke Theater. So thank you, one and all, and I'll turn it over to Taylor. Thank you so much.
So much, Sophie. Yeah, it's really an honor to be in the same virtual space as everybody here. I'm calling from Honolulu, Hawaii, and I'm based in Kaimuki, and of course this is land of Kanaka Iwi, so I just want to acknowledge that. Welcome everybody. I think we're gonna just get started. I just have a initial low-hanging fruit of questions for each of you, just to kind of unearth a lot of the real complex topics that this film addresses. So I'm gonna start with Anthony. We were talking about this earlier, but you really organically weave in your personal connections with your family in Kauai and your relationship to Kauai and Hawaii overall throughout the film. And you do establish that from the very beginning of your film, but I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about how your family ties to Hawaii really informed your approach to making the film and sort of inspired the idea to make the film in the first place.
Yeah, I think it really comes from my first experience visiting as a child, where visiting as an outsider, but given so much welcome from my extended family and this whole experience of living on Hawaii that I was not seeing, but also being drawn to the kind of Hollywood image, the kind of romanticized image simultaneously, and thinking that that would somehow be relevant to them or appeal to them, or if that was some sort of connection, which it wasn't. So I think that was the starting point of these two parallel lines of interrogating the Hollywood depiction with very, very personal connection to my family and working my way out of that. That's really kind of, where really where it branched out. And it wasn't, I didn't know how far it would go, but I just knew that that's where where it all started.
And then Mike, you're co-producer, co-writer on the project as well. Can you share a little bit about what your relationship to Hawaii, was before making, getting involved in the project, and how your positionality in relation to Hawaii and sort of what you were, the content that you were working with, how that informed your creative process as you were working on the film?
Yeah, I didn't really have any special relationship with Hawaii before working on the film. You know, Anthony and I met at a residency in New York called Union Docks, and we made a short together called Third Shift, which was about the Domino sugar refinery on the waterfront in Williamsburg, and kind of followed two older residents of Williamsburg who had worked at the Domino plant for several decades. And it was right at the time when the Domino factory or refinery building was being turned into sort of luxury condos. So we were kind of did some research into the sugar, history of the sugar trade. And I knew that we discussed that his family had a connection in Hawaii, and had come over from the Philippines to work in the sugar plantation. So, and then of course with the sugar and the history of kind of labor and then the kind of takeover of real estate, there was lots of sort of thematic parallels with what eventually became Cane Fire. So once Anthony kind of had an idea to start doing the film, and started going over and taking trips to Kauai and shooting some things and bringing them back and showing me. And I think because Anthony filmed it, I mean, he did everything himself when he was in Kauai. He shot and recorded the sound, and it was really like a one-man operation. So I think because he was chasing down the various threads kind of in real time, my role was, as someone who has very similar politics and similar tastes as Anthony, would work together. So he would just show me what he filmed, and we'd talk about what was working and what was making sense. And I think I kind of sort of a perspective that could sort through the kind of heaps of material he was gathering and kind of start to shape it together, and could understand give them a sense of what people would understand, and how we would sort through this material as a viewer who's not familiar with what's going on in the island. So, and then of course I learned a lot about Kauai over the years of doing the project.
Mhm.
Awesome. And Kiara, being a Kanaka filmmaker and documentarian, working in nonfiction, and covering a lot of similar issues in your work. When you saw the film, like what really resonated with you? Like what struck a chord with you?
It felt really personal. And I think that's always, like, for me, the most exciting entry and the most effective entry into getting people to understand the issues of an area. And I think, Anthony's willingness to kind of introduce the world to his family and his connection to this place and the complexity of it, I think really gave me, and hopefully the audiences that watch the film, the opportunity to understand what a place means, and what it means to connect to some place, which is, I think today in this world, is something that feels more and more foreign, but is also at the same time more and more important to think about.
Mm. And Jeff, you're also born and raised in Hawaii, also Native Hawaiian and Chinese descent, and have a very deep and broad understanding of American pop culture and politics. I mean, when you watch this film, what really stuck out to you?
Oh wow, so much. I think my thinking process and the way that I kind of write too is to uh is always to kind of go really wide, and also try to have it hit home. And so Cane Fire is a ride. It starts very personal and beautifully, and sort of in a small kind of space with Anthony's family, and then brings in like this whole kind of cinematic history, and moves from that into the transformation of Hawaii's economy, right, from um, serving via sugar and pineapple to serving via selling off land, and taking care of tourists, and it's so powerful. And then also to be able to capture the pieces of resistance that are occurring. It just really resonates for me on so many levels, and I feel like it's part of this new wave of storytelling from the islands right now. I think of Kiara's Out of State and This Is How We Rise, and I think of Chris Kahunahana's Waikiki and Anthony and my's mutual friend Chris Yogi's I Was a Simple Man. It's been a really amazing period to kind of see this flowering, yeah, of storytelling in this really, really critical moment in, I think, Hawaiian history, and also in terms of a global uprising, around race and the legacies of colonialism.
Mm. And Anthony, we were also talking about this earlier, and I'm wondering if because I want us to kind of get to kind of a lot of the political and social issues that the film addresses, but kind of before we kind of dive deep into that, I kind of want Anthony, if you could spend a little bit of time sharing about how you approached weaving together all the different types of materials that you're working with, whether from like archival material, found footage, your interviews, and then how your approach to form directly influenced kind of the political messaging that's also baked into the film as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, obviously there's so many major themes, and Mike and I always had those in mind, and it was kind of, for speaking about just one archival source for the Hollywood films, it was looking at them chronologically, how they were speaking in parallel to actual real existence on the island. And I think at first glance, it's maybe easy to say they're just escapism, but the more you look at the history, they're done in the service of different ideologies, statehood, military, tourism. And so the next step of looking at the Hollywood films for us was kind of dividing them into different categories of like, well, what are they commenting on? Are they speaking about the time? Are they, what's the overall message? And then as well with the escape fantasy films as well, and kind of having those as back and forth conversations with people that were, living in parallel. And that was kind of that era. And then it was looking at user created YouTube videos that was either tourism, tourist visiting the island, or recent transplants that were kind of redefining what their experience was on the island, informed by this past history built up by the tourist industry in Hollywood. And so it was all of these sources in conversation with each other, in conversation with, an oral history with people that have lived these very significant periods with different perspectives. And we kind of made every theme kind of function on its own, and always was conscious of how one was commenting on the other. And that was obviously, it was a dense process because there's there's too much material of archive of Hollywood films, and choosing something that really felt truthful. It wasn't just connecting the dots. When we had the one clip of the guy, the cruise ship guy, it wasn't a moment of just a gotcha moment of this one person. This is a whole iceberg of these kind of experiences and interactions filtered through YouTube that we're showing, that we think is indicative, not just bad behavior of one person. So it was really using those sources. The approach, I think Jeff, I like the way you say the ride, because we really wanted it to be immersive in a way that we didn't we didn't put the archive at arm's length. We kind of used kind of its initial, its kitsch value, its appeal, its kind of allure as a way to propel the story and comment on it at the same time, which is a tricky balance because you can be sucked in by it and, you know, going too far. But we also thought that having something about Elvis at arm's length gave him too much power, or it gave it too much weight. Like, why not, you know, use it in this ride to tell a story, because it is part of the story. Yeah.
And Michael, you know, when you were kind of working with Anthony to kind of sort through all the material to kind of put it together in a cohesive, you know, way, like what were some of the challenges and that you encountered when you are also learning and digesting, you know, all the different threads?
Yeah, I mean, balancing the different elements is, you know, probably the major challenge. And it's one of those things that, you know, when you show it to people along the way, rough cuts, the kind of go-to response is always to just, oh, well, there's too much going on. You need to eliminate this thread or that thread or focus on the personal side of it. And it was always, I think, really important to both Anthony and I that we didn't do that, that we wanted to make this kind of multi-voice, multi-pronged approach work. And, you know, I think that's part of why the film took so long to finish, is just, it took a long time to balance out, you know, the different subjects and themes and threads and figure out which ones would have to fall by the wayside. And so it was just a process of, you know, trying a lot of different combinations and seeing how the material would, you know, complement complement the themes together and, you know, be manageable for a viewer, but also not, you know, spoon feed anything to people. We wanted it to be a complicated experience that you have to sit with afterwards. So it just took a long time to, you know, restructuring and rewriting voiceover and all that to get to that place. But
yeah, it's very difficult to again, I like this ride idea because it's like to kind of stay on the ride. It's like to use a source and decontextualize it properly. You know, if it's a Hollywood source, make it so that, you know, extracting the original intent or, you know, commenting on it without throwing off the viewer and letting them kind of, you know, keep it going forward as these with all these disparate elements was very tricky to do, and it took a lot of reworking the ride.
With the ride metaphor, it's like a good ride. At certain points, you want to get off the ride, or you're like, where is it going? And you do kind of want that built into the experience of watching the film, except you want it to, you know, come back together at the end. So finding that balance where, you know, there might be times where a viewer's like, there's so many things going on, and just having the faith that we'd be able to put it together in a way that would be satisfying in the end.
Yeah.
I have one more question for Anthony, and then I want to circle back to Jeff and Kiara, because, like, Anthony, you were sharing with me earlier how like hip hop ethos and sampling and remixing really inspired your approach to editing, and it made me think about, you know, ownership of the image in addition to how the film comments on like ownership of land, ownership of resources, and how disparities, you know, play out in that way. Can you talk a little bit more about how, you know, the hip hop ethos inspired you when you're working with the materials?
Totally. I have a hard time articulating it sometimes, but I think just in the basic level is, you know, creating culture from without permission, you know, with available means. And, you know, when it came to mass media, you know, I felt, you know, that we should be allowed to repurpose it, comment on it without any, you know, it's without being discouraged. And but then also being almost the reverse, being very conscious of what we do use, and that's that has value in itself, and is very personal. Like, for example, the Waimanalo eviction, you know, that's not that's such a powerful short documentary. And, you know, we talked to Joan Lander, the director. We talked about using it and like being, you know, licensing it and how it was going to work into the film, spending a lot of time on that. But then having an equal disrespect for Hollywood sources and using whatever you can grab, and publicly uploaded, you know, tourism videos. And I think that's one way of, like, hip hop ethos, where it's like they were creating something and then the culture kept caught up, and whatever licensing, like in film we have fair use licensing, so we can comment on something, but it's a gray area because it's a legal gray area that has no guarantee. And so I think with Mike and I, everyone at the start, and maybe positions of authority and grants institutions were like, you shouldn't do this because it's not a guarantee that it'll be marketable, or you'll finish it, and no one's going to invest their time on something that's so unstable, and so we just kind of ignored that, and we just kind of kept a small circle of people, of friends and filmmakers, and shared the project with them, and with no expectation that there would ever be anything out the other end that would actually be a sellable product, because it wasn't, we wanted to be really true to what felt right in the film. And if it felt excessive, then, someone that we trusted for their taste would tell us it felt excessive. But being conscious of like, what is a kind of a rule of like, well, you're not allowed to do this, just because, it's that was kind of more of that was provocative, because it was like, we didn't want to start off critiquing a source that we were also simultaneously cowed by. Like, we wanted to have the power to comment on it the way we wanted to. And I think that, again, with the ride, it's like we felt that doing it in a way that immersed yourself in the core material, and you're getting the commentary from it, but you're using the source material however you need to get that point across, rather than having more hands-off, historical reference of an archival clip.
Yeah. I'm gonna go to Jeff next, and then I'll go to Kiara. But Jeff, like, when you saw the film, like, did that kind of, sampling, kind of hip hop ethos register for you when you watched it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I immediately recognize Anthony as like a kindred. So in terms of having that in hip hop, we call it the crate digger aesthetic, right? Where it's basically about chasing down these sources, and then the sources of the sources, and the sources of the sources, and filling up your crate with all of these different types of references that become in and of themselves kind of a puzzle to kind of piece out, right? And I just love the breadth of it. Like everything from, Anthony mining his own personal stories and the stories of his family, and then the tourist videos, all the way, and the tragedies that are attendant in history. And I mean, like, even the video of that labor movie where Pablo Manlapit's like character is whiteface, right? I mean, it's brownface. It's a white guy playing this Pablo Manlapit character, right? And then all the way over to Dino Croc. So it's like, yeah, like that is just, to me, we were like, oh yeah, this makes. I was watching it with my partner, and we were just like, yeah, this makes perfect sense. This is our world. This is a remix of history, to be able to present it from the point of view of local folks and Native Hawaiian folks.
Kiara, you also do such great work in working with archival footage, interviews, found footage, in your own films, and I know you have really amazing thoughts about ownership of image, and how as a filmmaker, one approaches that with either irreverence or respect. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about that, in your own experience.
Yeah, and just to get started, I think Anthony and his team did an incredible job of like incorporating the historical works into King Fire, and the approach with that is always, it's like clay, right? And these are just images and clips, and it's how you set up the context that really like where it is in like the montage, where it like how it's presented, I think makes it become something new, right? It uses it in a way that yeah, it becomes a new function. So, you know, you see the film, an original film, right? A 1950s film, and it means one thing when you're watching it. And then when an artist like Anthony comes and like cuts it into something new, like that's the exciting part, right? That's when it's transformative. And I think anytime we can take pre-existing work and find something new from it and create new works from it, I think there's something really beautiful about that. Um, and I think there's also something really powerful of being able to revisit the work in that way, like with supercuts, even, you know, to kind of take away some new meaning from it. Yeah, and it's whatever the vision the artist has, whether it's, you know, commentary, whether it's, you know, in alignment with the work too. um yeah, it's just exciting. It's a different kind of clay, and I think sometimes people are remiss, like they miss the point. They like think that, you know, when you go to archival, you know, this is a staid, it can be very staid and boring, and that's truly not the case. I think one thing even I as a filmmaker am reminded of is how powerful context is, right? If we don't understand where we're coming from, then we can't really evaluate and understand where we are at today. And so, you know, that again is the power of the work that was done in Cane Fire. It's like the contextual elements that the archival brings to the film are critical to making audiences who are familiar and unfamiliar with the story that Anthony's bringing forth, to really let them know what that mountain has been, you know, to overcome. Like, how do you overcome this like image of like this, you know, the savage, right? Like, how do we overcome that? And how much is that like uh embedded into like the zeitgeist? It's you know, we don't even realize sometimes like where things have come from. So that kind of dialectic and visual dialectic is critical.
This is a more open-ended question for everybody. Anybody can chime in, but do we think it's possible to challenge, you know, the infrastructure of tourism or the infrastructure of, you know, land ownership in Hawaii without challenging Hawaii's over-reliance on the Hollywood image or, you know, mainstream media in its own? Yeah, I'm gonna drop that there.
Boom. Well, that was a big one. I'd love to hear Anthony's. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think so much of it is about is being catered to the outsider as this fantasy to you know, like Bali High, like they're seeking their own island, and it's not it's transactional, but there's no power on the side of Hawaii. You know, it's I feel like so much of the tourist structure is about making the visitor feel like they can be whatever, behave however they want, interact however they want, whatever makes them feel the most comfortable. And there's not enough tension for them to, you know, yeah, it's an uneven power exchange, and I don't really know how to do that unless it was really, you know, more substantial and redone, reworked.
Well, I think part of the using the Hollywood sources in Cane Fire also is what Kiara was just saying is, you know, part of the way those kind of, you know, light, disposable pop culture entertainments work is that they kind of happen and people absorb them at the time and then move on. And it really, I think in a lot of ways, the culture is discouraged in looking back at those kinds of products and seeing what they were actually saying about the time in which they were made and how that might be unsettling to us from a contemporary perspective. And I think that the kind of gray area copyright law and the discouragement you get for making films the way that we did by just disregarding, you know, that kind of copyright laws the function of that is to not really, it limits what you can say about the past and who can say it. And I think that part of going back and looking at those films, and I mean, in a lot of cases, the ideological content is shockingly blatant and just overtly racist, sexist, etc. And it's important to kind of go back and dig through that material to see how this, because whatever the general public has in terms of their consciousness of like Hawaii right now, those images kind of form the bedrock of that attitude. And I think it would be hard to talk yourself out of it without going back and re-examining how you got there.
Mm-hmm.
I was just struck by the continuity, the continuities that play out from past to present, actually. And so, thinking about like the rendering of labor strikers, having white characters play them, and then they're crazed and hysterical, and just um, wanting to kind of burn everything down. But this is like these are folks who are in brownface, and then contrasting that later on with the the sort of cultish, like new agey tribal folks who are wiping clay all over themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a way to, I think, watch the movie where it's possible for folks to be able to really draw like continuities, to understand that the exploitation of workers, and before that, and at the beginning, the taking, the stealing of the land, and the suppression of Hawaiian culture, that's all a part of the same structures that now have people talking about, we're building homes in plantation elegance. You know what I mean? So I think that I think that it's really subtle what you all are doing, and maybe I'm giving too many things away, or this is too strong a read. But that's what I see or saw in a lot of what you had put together.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff, yes, absolutely. Like this idea of the revised nostalgia for the plantation era system. It's not, again, like it's not to say that that people don't have histories from there. So there's a fondness for history, but also at the same time, unless we challenge what's problematic from the history, that romanticism is built on something dark, right? And I think that, in order for us to find a solution, we have to be able to diagnose what the issues were that we trace our history back from. And I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish, but I do think as more content and comes out from within the community, we see an expansion of voices as like, and this is not even necessarily about studio versus studio or non-studio content, but like just more content from a multiplicity of view, then I think like we begin to reframe, revisit, maybe dismantle some of the problematic images that have entered into the zeitgeist. When more people make work like Anthony and Michael have, like, and we have more conversations like that, I think that's part of the antidote. Like that's part of what gets us ahead. And the solution isn't necessarily speedy, right? Because what got us here is like many years of propagating a very problematic image, but at least this is a start, right?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, everyone touched upon a little bit about how, we're seeing this sort of collective rise of sort of local or Hawaii-based storytelling that is, very much speaking to Kiara, what you're saying. And I keep thinking back to the moment in the film where I think it was the IWLU current president who says something to the effect of, an uprising is going to happen, maybe not in her lifetime, but like, history, will likely repeat itself in that way. Like, how do we believe that a collective community challenge to the infrastructures of tourism and land ownership is possible in our lifetimes. Um,
I think that we have to go forward, assuming it won't. Like we have to be patient and think forward, but knowing uh, knowing that things can move slow or they can move really fast. It's not, but if we're all, it's so much that's not in our control. But if we're all kind of moving in the same direction and with a real discipline and focus, like Mike and I made this film just a conversation, but there's so much in in the Native Hawaiian sovereignty movement, like in labor movement. There's so much organizing and thankless work that is going so slow in one direction. It's I think it's a fantasy to imagine this big revolt, but I think it's all about these kind of small, everyone doing a small effort in one direction without the promise that there's going to be something in our lifetime on the other end. That's just my.
Kiara, I'm gonna go back to you and because I've been thinking about your recent film, This Is the Way We Rise, and how you document what happened on Mauna Kea, and the kind of real life tangible example there of community organizing to shut down a development project. From what you learned in the making of that film, like, are there examples, like what can we learn from that example that might apply to some of what I think Anthony's film is calling for?
I think what we can learn and what we can be hopeful for is that these like standing practices that that disregard the voices of people from a place, and this long-standing colonial mindset that the outsider is the one with the best perspective, or is the one with the perspective of power. And I think that the hope is we can shift what that power dynamic is. And it's not, I think, maybe even just looking at people face to face, right? It's not about looking down or looking up, but just having real and honest conversations. I think even, if we're talking about the perspective of power dynamic between people, like tourism culture to date is about is an extension of the service industry, right? So if you're going somewhere to feel like you're being serviced, why should you feel like you need to think about the place that you're going to in a different way? Why should you feel like there is the need for a respect or a need for something? Why should you have to think about what the needs of that place are, what the economic, political, and environmental limitations are of a place if it's for you, right? And so some of that is to shift the idea that, you have the privilege, the opportunity to come, and you should have a great time, but maybe it's not because this place has been made for you. This place exists, and it's an incredible place, but it is not there to serve solely your whim. It's a place filled with people, and you can enter into it, but they're not there for your soul, to service your fantasy vacation. They're there to be participatory, but the dynamic is different.
I was really struck in the movie about how you all use the ruins of the cocoa palms as this powerful, powerful symbol. And so you have these Kanaka activists who are saying, here's where our lo'i were, right? Our taro fields where we grew our food. Here's where our iwi are. Here's where our ancestors are buried. And this is what you built on top of it. And so we are trying now to be able to show you the relations of people and place and histories and the ancestors and our food and the things that give us sustenance. And I'm just brought back over and over again to the moment in This Is the Way We Rise, where Kiara, you show Jamaica saying it's about Pilina, it's about the relationships, right? It's about what the relations are to each other. And what's really powerful, I think, about both This Is the Way We Rise and Cane Fire is it illustrates all of these different types of relations in a way that kind of overturns the way that relations appear to be, right? That this is the web of relations that actually um, exist and have been buried and suppressed, and the way that you think of relations has literally turned into ruins. And what do? You have people touring the ruins now. So it was just such a powerful kind of image. I look back in family pictures, and my mom and dad, um, they got married in the 60s, and they couldn't afford to go anywhere but the Cocoa Palms, right? To get on the plane and go to Kauai and go to the Cocoa Palms. So that was like their way of getting out of their lives for their particular moment and feel catered to for a little moment before they had to go back to their working lives. And yet this is where we're at now, right? And so it's this is why I think all of these stories are so important in this particular moment. We're now in pandemic. People cannot travel the way that they used to, right? There's a reckoning that's happening economically in the islands as well as spiritually in the islands that the Mauna was very much a part of. And so this is, I feel like, sort of an inflection point in this ongoing renaissance. And the stories that are coming out now are so important for people in Hawaii to be able to affirm, oh yeah, we're not being crazy, right? Like, this tourist stuff is actually gaslighting us. This is the real truth. And then for folks outside the islands to be able to say, oh wow, like all of that sort of fantasy island stuff that I got like in my mind about all of this, like I should really think about that. That's why it's so important, I feel like.
Anthony, can you share a little bit more about how you became connected, how you built your own relationships with the Kanaka activist community in your film?
Yeah, that was interesting because so much of the film is things that have, you know, that aren't happening before my eyes of an action, looking at past land actions. And with in Wailua, I had already kind of followed Cocoa Palms, so it was always a place that I knew had this overlap of these extreme themes of like, yeah, golden Hollywood golden age nostalgia and extreme sacred land, and with burials, and that the two would be focused on top of each other, or the Cocoa Palms on top of the burials and the temple. It was something that I was always surrounding. And then it wasn't until 2000, later in the filming process, that the activists actually began restoring the land on that property, and I began talking to them. But I think what I wanted to be like, I guess, conscious of is that they had a very particular mission, and I felt that it was, my film was interweaving with it, and they were in conversation with another, but I didn't want to waste their time of what their mission was, and I was sympathetic to it and interested in it. So we had a deal of, they would get to tell their story and get into more of the actual details of how they're going about this. And, once we were done filming, I would give them the material to do what they wanted with it to aid that goal. Unfortunately, as you see in the film, it dissipated, it collapsed, so it didn't work out. So I don't know actually how that would look like, seeing it through to the very end, what they would have created. But that was what I thought was an exchange that felt appropriate for that scenario.
And I kind of want to go back to the idea of relationships and how re-envisioning our relationships feels like a key to kind of unlocking some of the solutions. I'm wondering if, and I guess it's an open-ended question, if anyone wants to speak to kind of the way Cane Fire balances and confronts both settler colonialism in Hawaii and also the kind of the organic ways multiple generations of immigrants have, become woven into the fabric of the community over time. And how that creates a real complex insider-outsider identity politics locally. And anyways, I thought the film really beautifully confronted that. I'm curious how everyone here if anyone has reactions to that.
Well, one thing maybe just to start off is one of the reasons we started using the more kind of user-generated media that Jeff mentioned before, the tourist on the cruise ships, the YouTube guy, and the clay face painting, new age kind of tribal yoga cult thing, was that we noticed that after a certain point, once in the kind of neoliberal era, culture really doesn't deal with the real world much anymore. It doesn't really. The films that were made that were set in Hawaii just used it purely as a blank backdrop. And even though the older films were very racist and condescending to the worker movement, they did at a certain level acknowledge there are owners and workers and bosses. They were just against the workers. They're on the wrong side of it. But there was a certain acknowledgement, built into the narratives was a kind of ideologically skewered recognition of certain material conditions. Whereas once we got into the later films, they're really just pure kind of tourist, pretty backdrop films. And what we noticed when we started looking at YouTube and that kind of material was this very blatant reemergence of this sort of colonial mindset of the face painting. And I think a lot of the work that the culture industry, or whatever you want to call it, in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s was doing is to just sort of erase all of the rough edges of what was going on the ground and to just not have that even be part of the conversation. But I think when you turn it over back to the users, I think this is something that in general is going on in the Trump era, is that this ugliness comes out and they don't even know that they're expressing it. It's just this kind of pure, unconscious, the unreflective expression of this power dynamic comes out. And so we felt that was part of why we started to use that kind of material, because we thought it laid bare those kind of relationships in a way that more kind of official mainstream pop culture had become very good at not revealing. So that was one thing.
I guess to speak to the tensions between different groups on Hawaii, it was an education for me when I was drawn to my great grandfather's story, very, very proud and excited about his activism, but then kind of appreciating after a time that this was him and my great uncle working within a system that is, around statehood and a particular way of looking at ownership and property, and having to acknowledge that for Kanaka Maoli, it's the land relationship, they're looking at it differently, and that there's how the two are conflict, but also these groups are also being controlled overall by larger forces of landowners. So it's like having to parse that out and be honest about that, and respect the tensions between the group, but then also showing how there's a broad connection between overall.
Yeah, you kind of see it too, even in the relationship between your uncle and your cousins. Yeah, like there's the like your cousins are like River has a Hawaiian name, Alakai, and um, Micah, does net fishing, and your uncle has that moment where he says, "Wow, I wish I knew the language. I wish I knew the culture." Um, and so that was really powerful, and I think it captured sort of what's in motion, right now, actually generationally, that's happening too. That the older generation literally lived through this period of forced Americanization and a pushback against labor and sort of radical interracial organizing, and that now the younger generation is embracing their identity,
Yeah.
And understanding sort of the that local culture is built on this foundation of Hawaiian culture in a way that previous generations, even my own, like didn't necessarily recognize.
Right.
I'm wondering, like, Jeff, I keep thinking to something that you've written about, like the sort of in between sort of identity, like this in between space of identity, and how, especially in current generations, or like I kind of include myself in that generation, how that's become increasingly nuanced and layered. Um, and then you add to that the Hawaii diaspora, because so many of our people have to move away from Hawaii because of the high rising cost of living. And I'm wondering, this is to turn this into an open-ended question that anyone can respond to, how we see sort of the increasingly nuanced understanding of who we are, as as people who are sort of rooted to Hawaii, and also factoring in the Hawaii diaspora element of that, as a like how the diaspora and the current generation of identity politics poses challenges and opportunities as we think of collective liberation in Hawaii. Thoughts on that?
Oh, so
Whoa.
many questions. Yeah.
It's my attempt to this film it unearths all these complex questions though, and I mean, I know for me personally, I'm so grateful that this film exists, because very few films exist that allow us to talk about these levels, these layers of our reality. So yeah.
Well, if we're gonna break down the question, it's like, part of this is, where do we call home? Who's allowed to call a place home, right? And that's thinking about that. Sometimes it's about how long you spend in a place. It's about how much money you have, right, to be in a place, and how that centers your voice. Capitalism. If we are talking about the sectors of people who call a place home, right? Like we have said, like the indigenous community. We have said like settlers, which include people who have been there, for generations. I'm not an academic, so I can't really speak to the definitions of that, but like, and people who are more newly introduced. And then when we add on diaspora, right, that diaspora is not only for, the Kanaka population that can no longer, that no longer lives in a space, which is problematic when we define when we define people as native. Are they no longer native if they're not connected to the land, right? And that's not necessarily something I agree with, but I think is inherent to what the definition of indigenous or native is, right? And that's where we get these new terms like urban Indian, right? Who is the urban Hawaiian? I haven't heard, I don't hear that, and I'm not an academic, but is that something we should start having that conversation about, how we recognize the diaspora, and then also settler diaspora, people whose families grew up and live in Hawaii and still feel that tie. There's something incredibly powerful about this place, about Hawaii, that even if you haven't been here for years, even if your family might not have been here for a generation, like your mom grew up here, but you grew up in Delaware, like there is something about here that you still call this place home. Even if you've been in San Francisco for 20 years, even if you've been in New York for 20 years, whether you're Kanaka or not, this place has a power to it. And I don't know, I can say like, these are the pieces, but I don't know. I just don't.
You unpacked a lot, though, way more articulately than I could have attempted to. I'm wondering, Jeff, if you have thoughts on this landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would be one of those folks. I never thought about it till now, but yeah, I guess I'd be one of those folks in the diaspora. Um, Although it's not it's fluid, right? Because I unless it was COVID, like I could, if I had enough money, I could just jump on the plane and go back and be there, um, and and then when I come back, then there's all there's all the relations, right? There's all, like, everything just um, falls right in. So it's really complicated, and I think that. Um, I want to maybe just to kind of bring it to Cane Fire. One of the things that it sparked for me was when you guys brought in Namaka Okaina's video, right, of the clearing at Waimanalo Beach State Park, yeah. That when I taught one time, we taught this class at UCLA, and we showed Act of War and that clip is in there. And it was interesting because we had a bunch of kids, some who had never been to Hawaii, and then some who had roots in Hawaii. Their family members were from Hawaii. They identified a lot with Hawaii because maybe they went back every summer or that kind of thing, spent it with their grandparents. And then folks from Hawaii, right? And when we play that clip, there was one person who had a very, very strong negative reaction. She said that we were emotionally manipulating her by playing this clip. And this was in the 90s, so it was right when Act of War had just come out. It was a brand new movie. And it was interesting to me that she felt so strongly to say that we were manipulating, because she wasn't born in Hawaii, but she and her grandfather was a Nisei who came up in the sort of Nisei generation, right? McKinley High School, the whole thing, yeah. So it was a type of thing where she had a perception and an understanding of Hawaii that she felt was different from a person who was just going to be a tourist to the islands, and that the sovereignty movement and the sort of creative output that had come out during that particular period was forcing her to reconsider different types of things, but that she might have been a person considered herself to be in the diaspora. So it's all of these different types of levels, and then how do you kind of work that out now that so many people have been displaced, literally, right, in from Diamond Head, like, right, to all the way to like people who feel like, well, I can't come back because we can't build a fifth floor to our house anymore, right? Like that we just they're not going to let us do it anymore. They passed the law, so we can't. So it's very complicated. It's very complicated.
This can go on forever. This is I feel like we just kind of scratched the surface a bit, but I know we're short on time now, and I'm I'm just, maybe if Anthony, if you have any final thoughts to share, any like takeaways that you would want our audience to you know take with them beyond this conversation.
Yeah, it's too bad Kiara wasn't able to talk more about Mauna Kea, but I think it's really exciting that it's happening. It's so strong right now, and it's been going on for a long time, but that it's building this momentum is very inspiring, and I would encourage people to look it up and read more about it. Also, acknowledging that COVID is happening and we're in a pandemic. Definitely. A mutual aid in Hawaii, Corona Care Hawaii is a really amazing group that's providing like immediate assistance in Oahu, and I think it's just really great. So I would encourage people to check them out, donate. Yeah.
It's exciting how many community-driven efforts have risen over the past few years, both in the local film scene, also in community activist spaces, and there are a lot of really exciting examples of collective organizing that's been happening. So I just want to shout that out. Just thank you all so much for being part of this conversation, and it's to be continued, quite frankly. And it's been an honor, and thank you so much to MoMA and to Anthony and Mike and the film team for making this film.
Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Kiara.